Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez pressed her eye against the scope of her M4A5 sniper rifle, watching the dust cloud kicked up by the departing Chinook helicopters grow smaller against the harsh Afghan sky. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades faded into an ominous silence that settled over the Kunar Province mountains like a burial shroud. Something was wrong. Everything about this evacuation felt like a knife sliding between her ribs. "Rodriguez, we need to move now," Corporal Jenkins, her spotter, grabbed at her ghillie suit sleeve with trembling fingers. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool mountain air, and Maya could smell the fear radiating from him like sour milk. "The birds won't wait, and command says we've got 20 minutes before the airstrikes turn this valley into glass." Maya didn't budge. Through her scope, she watched 620 Marines scattered across Forward Operating Base Viper like startled sheep. Their faces turned skyward in disbelief as their lifeline disappeared into the clouds. These weren't just numbers on a roster. She knew their names, their stories, their fears. Private Martinez, who kept photos of his twin daughters taped inside his helmet. Sergeant Thompson, who'd saved her life during the ambush at Checkpoint Bravo. Lieutenant Collins, who'd written the same letter to his mother every week for 8 months, but never sent it. "The intel's bogus," Maya muttered, adjusting her scope's focus. Her trained eye swept the surrounding ridgelines, cataloging every shadow, every suspicious movement. She'd been watching these mountains for 3 weeks, learning their rhythms like a predator studies prey. The enemy positions she'd mapped didn't support the massive offensive that supposedly triggered this emergency withdrawal. "Look at the movement patterns, Jenkins. Where are the reinforcements? Where's the heavy equipment?" Jenkins squinted through his binoculars, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold them steady. "I don't know, Rodriguez, but I know I don't want to be here when those bombs start falling." The general himself ordered this withdrawal. "You want to explain to a court-martial why you ignored direct orders." The radio crackled with increasingly frantic transmissions from the valley below. Maya listened as squad leaders tried to maintain order among men who'd just been abandoned by their own command. The voices carried a mix of confusion, anger, and growing terror as reality set in. They were trapped in a natural amphitheater surrounded by enemy positions, with nowhere to run and limited ammunition. "Guardian Base, this is Viper Actual," came the voice of Colonel Harrison, the base commander. Maya had served under Harrison for 2 years and recognized the barely controlled panic in his usually steady tone. "Requesting immediate extraction for remaining personnel. We have wounded who can't be moved and insufficient transport for full evacuation." The response from headquarters was a burst of static followed by a cold, unfamiliar voice. "Viper Actual, this is Guardian Base. Negative on extraction. Air assets are unavailable. Maintain defensive positions and await further orders." Maya's blood turned to ice. She'd never heard that voice before, and she knew every officer in the command structure. Someone else was calling the shots, someone who wanted those Marines to stay exactly where they were. Her finger traced the trigger guard of her rifle as the pieces of a deadly puzzle began falling into place. That's when she saw them. Movement on the eastern ridge caught her attention, not the random shuffle of displaced civilians or the methodical patrol of friendly forces, but the coordinated advance of fighters moving with military precision. Through her scope, she counted at least 40 insurgents taking positions along the high ground, their weapons glinting in the afternoon sun. More movement on the western approach revealed another group, and then another on the northern slope. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, her mouth going dry. "It's a kill box." The withdrawal wasn't based on intelligence about incoming airstrikes. It was designed to isolate the Marines in a perfectly orchestrated ambush. Someone had fed the enemy detailed information about FOB Viper's defenses, troop strength, and evacuation procedures. This wasn't just a tactical disaster, it was betrayal at the highest levels. Jenkins followed her gaze and saw what she was seeing. His face went white as printer paper. "We need to warn them. We need to." The first RPG streaked across the valley like a comet, slamming into the base's communications array in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The explosion was the signal for hell to break loose. Machine gun fire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously, raking the Marine positions with devastating precision. Mortars began dropping with surgical accuracy on key defensive positions. Someone had provided the enemy with detailed maps of the base layout. Maya watched through her scope as Marines scrambled for cover, their return fire scattered and ineffective against enemies positioned on the high ground. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 12 different sniper positions, all with clear fields of fire into the valley. The Marines were pinned down, outgunned, and completely exposed. "Rodriguez, we have to go." Jenkins was pulling at her equipment now, his voice cracking with desperation. "The extraction point is 2 clicks north. If we move now, we can still make it before." Maya's rifle butt caught him across the jaw, dropping him to the rocky ground like a sack of grain. She knelt beside his unconscious form and spoke softly to his unhearing ears. "I'm sorry, Jenkins, but I can't watch them die when I can do something about it." She dragged his limp body into a sheltered crevice between two boulders, checked his pulse to make sure the blow hadn't killed him, and began stripping ammunition from his pack. 400 rounds of .308 Winchester, 12 high-explosive rounds, her sidearm with 6 magazines, 3 grenades, and enough water for maybe 2 days. Against an estimated 200 insurgents with heavy weapons and the high ground advantage. The math was simple. She was going to die. But maybe, just maybe, she could make that death count for something. Maya keyed her radio one last time, setting it to the emergency frequency. "Any Guardian base personnel, this is Overwatch 7. Be advised, Viper Base is under coordinated assault from multiple directions. This was not a random attack. Repeat, this was a planned ambush. Someone fed them our positions. I am remaining on station to provide sniper support. Tell my mother I'm sorry I missed her birthday." She switched off the radio and settled into her firing position, adjusting her scope for the 800-meter shot to the eastern ridge, where an enemy sniper was lining up on a group of Marines huddled behind a damaged Humvee. Through her crosshairs, she could see the insurgent's finger tightening on his trigger, his target clearly visible in the valley below. Maya took a deep breath, held it, and became the angel of death perched on the mountain of betrayal. Her first shot would announce to everyone, friend and foe alike, that the abandoned Marines weren't as alone as they thought. Guardian 6 was online, and she had a score to settle. The war for Fob Viper was about to begin, and Maya Rodriguez intended to write its opening chapter in blood and brass casings. Maya's first shot cracked across the valley like divine judgment. The enemy sniper on the eastern ridge jerked backward as the .308 round punched through his skull, his rifle tumbling into the ravine below. Through her scope, she watched the insurgents around him duck for cover, their heads swiveling in confusion as they tried to locate the source of death that had just visited their ranks. She was already moving before their muzzle flashes could respond, slithering across the rocky terrain like a serpent made of shadow and gilly netting. The second position was 40 meters north, behind a cluster of wind-carved boulders that provided both concealment and multiple escape routes. Maya had scouted these mountains for weeks, memorizing every crack, every ledge, every firing position. Now that knowledge would be the difference between life and death. Her radio crackled with chatter from the valley below, voices tight with fear and confusion. "Contact east. We've got contact from the eastern ridge." "Negative, that was outgoing fire. Someone's up there helping us." Guardian 6, if you can hear this, we have wounded in Sector 2. Can you provide overwatch?" Maya smiled grimly as she settled into her new hide. Guardian 6, she liked that call sign. It had a ring of divine intervention to it, and right now these Marines needed all the divine intervention they could get. She keyed her radio briefly. Guardian 6 copies, painting targets now. Through her scope, she identified the next threat, an RPG team positioning themselves behind a stone wall on the western slope. The gunner was young, maybe 19, with nervous hands that shook as he loaded the rocket-propelled grenade. His spotter was older, seasoned, barking orders in rapid-fire Pashto while pointing toward the Marines' ammunition depot. Maya adjusted for wind and elevation, her crosshairs settling on the RPG gunner's chest. The shot was 650 meters across a canyon with swirling mountain winds, a difficult shot even under ideal conditions. But these weren't ideal conditions, this was do or die. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and she watched through the scope as the young insurgent crumpled. His dying finger pulled the trigger reflexively, sending the RPG spinning wildly into the sky before exploding harmlessly against a cliff face. The spotter dove for cover, abandoning the weapon as Maya's second shot chewed up the stone wall where his head had been. Guardian 6, that's 2 down on the western approach. You just saved our ammunition dump. Maya was already moving again. This time to a position she'd nicknamed Devil's Perch on a narrow ledge 40 feet up the cliff face that offered commanding views of both the northern and eastern approaches. The climb was treacherous, requiring her to use her rifle sling as an improvised climbing rope while bullets whined overhead. One slip meant a fatal fall onto the jagged rocks below. As she hauled herself onto the ledge, Maya's radio exploded with urgent chatter. "Contact north. Multiple vehicles approaching from the North Valley." She swung her scope toward the northern approach and felt her stomach drop. A convoy of 5 pickup trucks loaded with fighters was racing down the mountain road, kicking up clouds of dust as they bounced over the rough terrain. Each truck carried at least 8 men with automatic weapons, and she could see the distinctive shape of a heavy machine gun mounted in the lead vehicle's bed. 80 fresh fighters with heavy weapons, approaching fast. The Marines below were already running low on ammunition after 30 minutes of sustained combat. When these reinforcements arrived, it would turn from a firefight into a massacre. Maya did the math quickly. 5 trucks, maximum effective range of her rifle was about 900 meters, vehicles moving at roughly 40 kilometers per hour over rough terrain. She had maybe 3 minutes before they reached the valley floor, and once they dismounted, they'd spread out too quickly for her to engage effectively. Guardian 6 to Viper Actual, she spoke into her radio while tracking the lead vehicle through her scope. I've got eyes on reinforcement convoy approaching from the north. 5 vehicles, approximately 80 hostiles. I can delay but not stop them. You need to be ready. Colonel Harrison's voice came back immediately, steady despite the chaos around him. Guardian 6, can you identify yourself? Command needs to know who's providing overwatch. Maya hesitated. Once she identified herself, there would be no going back. She'd officially be a rogue Marine operating outside the chain of command, disobeying direct orders to evacuate. But looking through her scope at the Marines below, kids barely out of high school fighting for their lives, the choice wasn't difficult. Negative, Viper Actual. Just call me your guardian angel. She lined up on the lead truck's windshield, tracking its movement as it bounced and weaved down the mountain path. The driver was bearded, experienced, keeping his speed steady despite the rough terrain. Maya led the target, calculating distance, wind drift, and the truck's velocity. At 850 meters, with a moving target and crosswinds, this was one of the most difficult shots she'd ever attempted. The rifle spoke, and Maya watched through her scope as the windshield exploded in a shower of glass and blood. The truck swerved violently to the left, clipped a boulder, and flipped 3 times before exploding in a ball of orange flame. The vehicles behind it scattered, drivers suddenly realizing they were being engaged by a sniper they couldn't see. Guardian 6, that's a hit. Lead vehicle down. But Maya was already tracking the second truck, which had veered off the road and was racing across open ground toward a cluster of rocks that would provide cover. The vehicle bounced wildly over the uneven terrain, making a clean shot nearly impossible. She waited, breathing steadily, until the truck hit a small rise and went momentarily airborne. In that split second of hang time, Maya's bullet found its mark. The driver slumped forward and the truck nosedived into the rocky ground, catapulting fighters through the air like rag dolls. Some didn't get up. The remaining 3 trucks had stopped and were disgorging their passengers, who immediately began spreading out and taking cover among the rocks. Maya could see muzzle flashes as they began returning fire, but they were shooting blind, unable to pinpoint her position on the cliff face. That's when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. While she'd been focused on the convoy, additional fighters had been moving into position on the eastern ridge. At least 30 more insurgents with what looked like a mortar team. They'd been using the convoy as a distraction while positioning for a coordinated assault. Guardian 6 to Viper Actual. Be advised, you've got mortars setting up on the eastern ridge, approximately 4,200 meters from your position. I count 3 tubes, maybe 4. Copy that, Guardian 6. Can you engage? Maya studied the mortar position through her scope. It was well protected, with sandbags and natural rock formations providing cover. The crews were disciplined, working efficiently to set up their weapons. These weren't local farmers with ancient rifles. This was a professional military unit with modern equipment and tactical training. Negative, Viper Actual. Range is too extreme for effective engagement with small arms. I'm going to try something else. She keyed her radio to an emergency frequency she'd memorized during intelligence briefings. Any coalition air assets, this is Guardian 6 operating in support of FOB Viper. Request immediate close air support for troops in contact. Multiple enemy positions with heavy weapons. We are surrounded and taking casualties. Static filled her earpiece for long moments before a crisp voice responded. Guardian 6, this is Devil Dog 27, flight of 2 A-10s about 15 minutes out from your position. Be advised, we show no active operations in your area. Can you authenticate? Maya's heart sank. Authentication codes were changed daily and distributed only to authorized personnel. As a lone operative operating outside the command structure, she had no way to prove she was legitimate. The A-10s wouldn't engage without proper authentication, and by the time she could establish her identity, the Marines below would be dead. Devil Dog 27, I cannot authenticate, but I've got 620 Marines about to be overrun by a coordinated assault. I need you to trust me on this one. Guardian 6, I'm sorry, but we cannot engage without proper authentication. Suggest you contact your C for updated codes. Maya switched off the radio in frustration. No air support, no reinforcements, and she was running low on ammunition. Through her scope, she watched the mortar crews complete their setup and begin loading rounds. In minutes, They'd start dropping high explosives on the Marines' heads, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do to stop it from her current position. That's when Maya Rodriguez made the decision that would either save 620 lives or get them all killed. She was going to leave her sniper's nest and take the fight directly to the enemy. It was suicide, but it was the only chance her fellow Marines had. She began the dangerous descent from Devil's Perch, her rifle slung across her back and death waiting in the shadows below. Maya hit the rocky ground with cat-like grace, her boots finding purchase on the loose scree as she descended from Devil's Perch. The distant thump of mortars echoed across the valley. The enemy had begun their bombardment. Through the chaos of explosions and automatic weapons fire below, she could hear the agonized screams of wounded Marines. Each cry was a knife twisting in her gut, driving her forward into the darkness. She had abandoned her sniper rifle, trading precision for mobility. The M9 pistol on her hip felt inadequate against what lay ahead, but close-quarters combat required different tools. Her combat knife, 7 inches of Damascus steel, rode in its sheath like a sleeping viper. 3 fragmentation grenades hung from her vest like deadly ornaments. This wasn't going to be about surgical strikes anymore. This was about getting her hands dirty in the blood and mud of close combat. The mortar position lay 800 meters northeast, but Maya wasn't foolish enough to attempt a direct assault. Instead, she began a circuitous route through the ravines and dead spaces she'd memorized during weeks of reconnaissance. The enemy had positioned sentries along the obvious approaches, but they were watching for threats from the valley below, not from the mountain above. Her first target appeared 20 minutes later, a young fighter smoking nervously behind a boulder, his AK-47 propped carelessly against the rocks. He couldn't have been more than 16, with the sparse beard of adolescence and hands that shook as he brought a cigarette to his lips. Maya studied him through the green glow of her night vision, noting his position, his weapon, his fields of fire. She moved like smoke across the rocky terrain, approaching from his blind spot. Her hand covered his mouth before he could scream, the knife sliding between his ribs with surgical precision. She held him as his life drained away, watching the light fade from his eyes, feeling the weight of another soul added to her ledger of death. Maya dragged his body into the shadows and checked his equipment. 2 magazines for the AK-47, a Chinese-made radio, and a grenade that looked like it had been manufactured sometime during the Soviet occupation. She took the ammunition and left the rest, melting back into the darkness as voices called out from nearby positions. Ahmed? Ahmed, where are you? The search would begin soon, but Maya was already moving toward her next objective. Intelligence had been her specialty before she became a sniper, and she'd learned to read enemy communications equipment during her tours in Iraq. If she could locate their command post, she might be able to disrupt their coordination and buy the Marines below precious time. The second sentry was more alert, scanning his sector with the practiced eye of a veteran fighter. Maya watched him from concealment, noting his pattern of movement, the way he checked his watch every few minutes, the nervous tick of adjusting his weapon sling. Professional habits that would get him killed. She waited until he turned to check his right flank, then struck like a viper. Her arms snaked around his throat, cutting off his air supply while her knife found his kidney. He struggled for perhaps 10 seconds before going limp in her arms, his rifle clattering against the rocks. This time, the radio chatter was immediate and urgent. Command, this is Outpost 7. We have lost contact with positions 4 and 5. Request permission to investigate. Maya pressed herself against the cold stone as bootsteps approached her location. 3 fighters moved past her hiding spot, their voices tense with growing alarm. She let them pass, then followed at a distance, using their own movements to guide her toward the command post. What she found exceeded her worst expectations. Hidden in a natural cave system carved into the mountainside, the enemy had established a sophisticated command center, complete with satellite communication equipment, computer terminals, and detailed maps of every coalition position in the province. This wasn't a ragtag insurgent operation. This was a professional military installation with resources that spoke of state sponsorship. But what made Maya's blood run cold were the documents scattered across the planning table. Aerial photographs of Fob Viper taken from American reconnaissance drones. Detailed troop rosters with the names and specialties of every Marine in the base. Communication frequencies, authentication codes, tactical procedures, information that could only have come from someone with the highest levels of security clearance. Son of a bitch, she whispered, photographing the documents with her helmet camera. Someone in the American command structure wasn't just feeding intelligence to the enemy. They were actively coordinating the destruction of their own forces. A voice from deeper in the cave complex made her freeze. Someone was speaking English with a distinctly American accent, talking on what sounded like a satellite phone. Phase 2 is proceeding as planned. The Marines are pinned down and taking casualties. Estimated time to complete elimination is 30 minutes. Have the cleanup crews standing by to remove any evidence of American involvement. Maya crept closer, staying in the shadows as she tried to identify the speaker. What she saw made her stomach lurch with betrayal and rage. Colonel Marcus Webb, supposedly killed in a helicopter crash 6 months earlier, stood alive and well in enemy territory, coordinating the murder of his own Marines. Webb had been Maya's commanding officer during her first tour, a man she'd respected and trusted. Now he was wearing civilian clothes and planning mass murder for money or ideology or some combination of both. "Sir, we have a problem," came another voice in accented English. "2 of our sentries have been eliminated. Someone is moving against our positions." Webb's face hardened. "Impossible. All American personnel were evacuated. Run a full perimeter sweep and increase security around the mortar teams. We cannot afford delays at this stage." Maya had heard enough. She armed one of her grenades and prepared to end this nightmare with a single decisive strike. But as she pulled the pin, her foot dislodged a loose rock that clattered down the cave wall like a bell announcing her presence. "Intruder in the command post," someone shouted in Pashto. Automatic weapons fire erupted in the confined space, muzzle flashes strobing like deadly lightning. Maya rolled behind a communication console as bullets chewed up the cave wall above her head, showering her with rock fragments and sparks from damaged equipment. Webb's voice cut through the chaos. "Take her alive. I want to know how she found us." Maya lobbed the armed grenade toward the satellite communication array and counted down from 4. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, destroying thousands of dollars of equipment and plunging half the cave into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie red shadows that danced across the walls like demons. She was already moving, using the confusion to close distance with the enemy fighters. Her pistol barked twice, dropping a man who tried to flank her position. Her knife found another target in the smoke and chaos, opening his throat in a spray of arterial blood that painted the cave walls crimson. "Guardian Base, this is Command 7, Webb was shouting into a backup radio. "Initiate Broken Arrow protocol immediately. Danger close, danger close." Maya's blood turned to ice. Broken Arrow was the code for friendly fire incidents, but in this context it could only mean one thing. Webb was calling in American airstrikes on American positions. He was going to finish what the ambush had started by using coalition air power to eliminate any witnesses to his treachery. She put 2 bullets center mass into the radio operator before he could complete the transmission, but the damage might already be done. Somewhere above them, American pilots might be receiving orders to bomb their own Marines based on fabricated intelligence about enemy positions. Webb himself was nowhere to be seen, having escaped deeper into the cave system while his men fought and died around the command post. But Maya had bigger problems than one traitorous colonel. She could hear vehicles approaching from multiple directions, their engines echoing off the canyon walls. Reinforcements were arriving, and her window of opportunity was closing fast. She grabbed what intelligence materials she could carry and fought her way toward the cave entrance, leaving a trail of bodies behind her. 3 more grenades cleared the passage, their explosions bringing down sections of the cave roof and sealing off pursuit routes. As Maya emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, she could see the situation in the valley below had deteriorated rapidly. The mortar barrage had intensified, and she counted at least 4 separate fires burning within the Marines' perimeter. Radio chatter indicated multiple casualties and ammunition running dangerously low. But now she knew the truth behind the betrayal, and she had evidence that could expose the conspiracy. The question was whether she could stay alive long enough to get that evidence to someone who could act on it. In the distance, she could hear the distinctive whine of jet engines approaching. The Broken Arrow protocol was active, and American warplanes were inbound to finish the job that treachery had started. Maya began running toward the valley, racing against time and her own mortality to save 620 Marines from being murdered by their own government. Maya Rodriguez tumbled down the rocky slope as the first F-16 screamed overhead, its engines drowning out the desperate radio calls from Fob Viper below. She could see the pilot banking for his attack run, probably believing he was targeting an insurgent stronghold based on Webb's fabricated intelligence. In 60 seconds, American bombs would rain down on American Marines unless she could stop it. Her helmet radio crackled to life as she sprinted across the uneven terrain, dodging between boulders as enemy fire chased her retreat. Guardian 6, this is Viper Actual. We have fast movers inbound, but they're not responding to our authentication codes. Something's wrong here. Maya keyed her radio while vaulting over a fallen log, her lungs burning from the thin mountain air. Viper Actual, Guardian 6. Those birds are targeting you based on false intelligence. You have a traitor in your command structure. Colonel Marcus Webb is alive and coordinating this entire operation. Static filled her earpiece for several heartbeats before Harrison's voice returned, tight with disbelief. Guardian 6. Colonel Webb died in a helicopter crash 6 months ago. His body was recovered and— Negative, Maya shouted, sliding behind a boulder as bullets sparked off the rocks around her. I just saw him alive in the enemy command post. He's working with insurgent forces and feeding them classified intelligence. The evacuation order came from him using compromised communication channels. She pulled out her helmet camera's memory card and held it up to the pale dawn light. Everything was on that tiny piece of silicon. Photographs of the documents, recordings of Webb's conversations, evidence of the most heinous betrayal in Marine Corps history. But evidence was worthless if she died with it in her pocket. The F-16 completed its banking turn and lined up for its bombing run. Through her binoculars, Maya could see the pilot's helmet silhouetted in the cockpit canopy as he armed his weapons systems. In the valley below, 620 Marines huddled in their foxholes, unaware that death was approaching from above in the form of American ordnance. Maya made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She switched her radio to the emergency frequency and began broadcasting in the clear, knowing that every intelligence service in the region would intercept her transmission. Mayday, Mayday, this is Staff Sergeant Maya Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps, serial number 2847-3951-0847. I am declaring a military emergency under Section 15 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. American aircraft are about to engage American forces based on false intelligence provided by a rogue officer. Her transmission was cut off by the roar of jet engines as the F-16 dove toward the valley. Maya watched helplessly as the pilot released his payload. 2 500-pound joint direct attack munitions that fell through the morning air like mechanical angels of death. But something unexpected happened. A second aircraft appeared from the east, an A-10 Thunderbolt painted with the distinctive nose art of the 354th Fighter Squadron. The Warthog pilot fired a burst of 30mm cannon rounds across the F-16's flight path, not to hit, but to warn. Razor 11, this is Devil Dog 27, came a voice over the emergency frequency. Abort your attack, run immediately. We have friendlies in that valley. Maya's heart soared as she recognized the voice of the A-10 pilot she'd spoken with hours earlier. Somehow, he'd stayed in the area and witnessed the developing situation. The F-16 pilot pulled up sharply, his bombs detonating harmlessly on the empty mountainside in twin pillars of fire and smoke. Devil Dog 27, this is Razor 11. My mission parameters show no friendly forces in this area. I have authorization for close air support against confirmed enemy positions. Negative, Razor. I've got eyes on Marines in that valley, and I just heard an authenticated emergency broadcast from one of their personnel. Someone's feeding you bad intel. Maya used the momentary confusion to break cover and sprint toward the valley floor. Behind her, she could hear vehicles approaching as Webb's remaining forces closed in for the kill. Her ammunition was exhausted, her body pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, but she had to reach the Marines below with the evidence that could save them all. She stumbled and fell, rolling down a steep incline before crashing into a cluster of thorny bushes that tore at her uniform and exposed skin. Blood streamed from a dozen cuts, mixing with the dirt and sweat that caked her face. Above her, helicopter rotors began to beat the air, reinforcements arriving, but for which side? Guardian 6, what is your status? Harrison's voice carried a note of desperation. The Marine colonel had been fighting this battle for hours, watching his men die, while struggling to understand how everything had gone so wrong. Maya tried to respond but found her radio had been damaged in the fall. The display flickered weakly before going dark, cutting her last link to the embattled Marines. She was alone now, carrying the weight of 620 lives and the evidence needed to expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of military command. The helicopters were closer now, and Maya could see Marine Corps markings on their fuselages. But were they legitimate rescue birds or more of Webb's deception? In this nightmare of betrayal and false intelligence, she couldn't trust anyone or anything at face value. A rifle shot cracked across the valley, and Maya felt the bullet tug at her sleeve. Enemy fighters were converging on her position from multiple directions, their muzzle flashes winking like deadly stars in the growing daylight. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached effective range with their automatic weapons. That's when the Marines of Fob Viper proved why they were considered among the finest warriors in the world. Even trapped and outnumbered, even bleeding and exhausted from hours of combat, they recognized one of their own in trouble and responded accordingly. Suppressive fire erupted from the valley floor as Marine riflemen engaged the insurgents pursuing Maya, forcing them to take cover and disrupting their coordinated assault. "Covering fire for Guardian 6, someone shouted over the radio. "All units provide covering fire for Guardian 6. Maya used the distraction to cover the final 100 meters to the Marine perimeter, her legs pumping like pistons as bullets whined overhead. A young lance corporal she didn't recognize grabbed her arm and hauled her over the defensive barrier, both of them tumbling into a foxhole as enemy fire intensified. "Ma'am, are you Guardian 6? The kid asked, his eyes wide with exhaustion and hero worship. He couldn't have been more than 19, with a baby face that belonged in a high school classroom rather than a combat zone. Maya nodded, too breathless to speak. She pulled the memory card from her damaged helmet camera and pressed it into the lance corporal's hands. "Get this to Colonel Harrison immediately. It's evidence of treason at the command level. Whatever happens to me, make sure this gets to higher authority." The kid nodded solemnly and began low crawling toward the command bunker while Maya slumped against the sandbagged wall of their position. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, and she could feel consciousness slipping away as exhaustion and blood loss took their toll. But the sound of approaching helicopters brought her back to full alertness. 3 UH-60 Black Hawks were settling onto the valley floor, their rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust and debris. Marines began emerging from the aircraft. Not the reinforcements she'd been hoping for, but military police with weapons drawn and zip-tie restraints ready. Colonel Harrison appeared at the entrance to her foxhole, his weathered face grim with the weight of command decisions. Behind him stood a figure Maya recognized from Pentagon briefings, General Patricia Stone, the Corps' Deputy Commandant for Combat Development. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Harrison said formally, "you're under arrest for disobeying direct orders, abandoning your post, and engaging in unauthorized combat operations." Maya struggled to her feet, swaying slightly as black spots danced at the edges of her vision. "Sir, with respect, I have evidence of—" "We know about the evidence," General Stone interrupted, stepping forward with the memory card in her hand. "We also know about Colonel Webb's activities, and we've been tracking his network for the past 6 months. Your intervention tonight disrupted a carefully planned counterintelligence operation." Maya felt the world spinning around her as the implications hit home. "You knew? You knew he was alive and working with insurgents, and you still sent those Marines into a trap? Sometimes the greater good requires difficult decisions," Stone replied coldly. "Webb's network has provided us with invaluable intelligence about enemy operations throughout the region. A few casualties were deemed acceptable losses in the larger strategic picture." The foxhole erupted in violence as Maya lunged for the general's throat, her hand seeking the woman who had callously written off 620 lives as acceptable losses. But her injuries and exhaustion betrayed her, and the military police quickly restrained her with zip ties as she struggled against them. "You sold them out," Maya spat, blood running from her split lip. "You sold out your own Marines for intelligence that could have been gathered through legitimate means." Stone's expression never changed as she watched the MPs prepare Maya for transport. "History will vindicate our decisions, Sergeant. The intelligence Webb provided has saved thousands of lives in other operations." As they dragged her toward the waiting helicopters, Maya could see the faces of the Marines she'd fought so hard to protect. Some looked at her with gratitude, others with confusion, but all of them were alive because she'd refused to follow orders that would have seen them murdered by their own government. The last thing she heard before unconsciousness finally claimed her was the voice of the young lance corporal she'd given the evidence to, shouting over the rotor noise, "Guardian 6, we won't forget. We won't ever forget what you did for us." 3 months later, Maya Rodriguez sat in a military prison cell, convicted of multiple charges but unrepentant. Outside her window, protesters chanted her name while social media campaigns demanded her release. The truth about Webb's network had eventually come to light through leaked documents, exposing the conspiracy that had nearly cost 620 Marines their lives. But Maya took no satisfaction in vindication. She'd learned that sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting the consequences, even when those consequences were unjust. The ghost of the Afghan mountains had become something larger, a symbol of conscience in an institution that sometimes lost its way. And in barracks and foxholes around the world, young Marines whispered her story to one another, a reminder that duty to your fellow warriors sometimes meant defying the very system you'd sworn to serve. Guardian 6 lived on, not as a person but as an idea that would never die.